Why did Officer Daniel Hayes, a seasoned officer, shoot Evelyn Johnson, a harmless 70-year-old black woman simply walking in the park? How could this tragic error happen in broad daylight? The community of Greendale is reeling in anger, demanding justice, while the media and the nation watch in shock. Was it racism, fear, or something far more insidious lurking beneath the surface? Stay tuned as the chilling truth unfolds in a way no one expected. Evelyn Johnson had always believed in the power of routine. Even in retirement, she found comfort in waking up with the first light of dawn, the way she had for decades during her years as a teacher. At 70, her life was quieter, but no less fulfilling. The children she had once taught still remembered her fondly. She'd spend her days reading, helping at the local church, or simply walking in the park. It was these small pleasures, her morning cup of tea, the birds chirping outside her window, that brought her peace. Greendale, her home for over 40 years, was a tranquil, idyllic town, a picture of the Midwest. Neighbors chatted over white picket fences, and children played on their bikes along the tree-lined streets. The town's pride was Greendale Park, a peaceful oasis where Evelyn often walked. The park had towering oaks, winding paths, and ponds that sparkled in the sunlight. This was her sanctuary, where she could reflect on the life she had lived, the love she had shared with her late husband, the joy of watching her 2 children grow, and the satisfaction of shaping young minds through her career. But on this particular morning, as she pulled on her old coat and scarf, Evelyn couldn't shake a strange sense of unease. Recent news had unsettled her. A spate of brutal murders had taken place in nearby towns, and police had issued warnings to stay vigilant. What made Evelyn feel especially uneasy was the vague description of the suspect. A black woman, older, and possibly armed. The words echoed in her mind as she sipped her tea. How could such violence make its way into a town like Greendale? As she walked out of her front door, the early morning chill nipped at her face, but it wasn't the cold that made her shiver. Greendale had always been her safe haven, but today, the world felt different. She hesitated for a moment on her porch, looking at the empty streets, before deciding to head to the park. It was her routine, after all. Routine was safe. Routine was comforting. On the other side of town, Officer Daniel Hayes sat in his patrol car, feeling the weight of a different kind of tension. Hayes had been a cop for nearly 2 decades, long enough to witness how much the world had changed, and not all for the better. Crime seemed to be on the rise, and with it came a fear that gnawed at him, an anxiety he couldn't shake. The recent murders had put everyone on edge, and the media's description of the suspect, a black woman, older, dangerous, stirred something deep inside him. Hayes liked to think of himself as a good cop, one who followed the rules and treated people fairly. But lately, something had shifted. There was a voice in the back of his mind, a voice he didn't like to acknowledge, whispering things about race and danger. He hated to admit it, but he had begun to see certain people as more suspicious than others, particularly black and brown individuals. He told himself it was just caution, part of the job. But in his heart, he knew it was more than that. It was fear, plain and simple. The call came in just as Hayes was finishing his morning coffee, a possible sighting of the suspect near Greendale Park. The details were vague, but the adrenaline shot through him like a bolt of electricity. He didn't need much more than that. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as he sped toward the park. This is it, he thought. This is the one. He was convinced the day had come to finally catch the killer. As Evelyn made her way through the park, the world felt serene. The leaves rustled gently overhead, and the smell of damp earth and pine filled the crisp air. Her cane tapped a soft rhythm on the gravel path, grounding her in the familiarity of her routine. She let out a deep breath, letting go of the tension that had briefly gripped her. The park was where she found her solace, and for the moment, the worries about the news faded into the background. The towering oak in the center of the park came into view, its broad branches reaching out like the arms of an old friend. She often stopped beneath that tree, leaning on her cane for support as she looked out over the park. Today was no different. She made her way toward the oak, her thoughts lost in the memories of her life, of her husband, who used to walk beside her, of her children, who had long since moved away but always called to check in on her. But her peace was abruptly shattered by the sound of screeching tires. She turned her head just in time to see a patrol car pull up fast, too fast for this quiet place. Before she could make sense of what was happening, a figure emerged from the car, a police officer, running toward her with a look of determination that frightened her. Why was he here? What could he possibly want with her? "Stop right there. Don't move." Officer Hayes' voice cut through the quiet morning air, sharp and commanding. The urgency in his tone sent a jolt of fear through Evelyn's body. She instinctively stopped, her cane slipping from her hand and clattering to the ground. Her heart raced. "What's going on?" she called out, her voice trembling with confusion. To Officer Hayes, the scene unfolding before him was one of danger. His mind raced, clouded by the description of the suspect that had been burned into his brain. The limp, the age, the color of her skin, it all seemed to match. His training had taught him to be cautious, but this was something more. This was paranoia, fueled by the media frenzy and his own unconscious biases. The world around him seemed to narrow, his vision tunneling in on the figure of the elderly woman before him. He saw her hand move. Was she reaching for something? A weapon? "I said stop," he shouted again, his voice rising with fear. He drew his gun, the weight of the weapon heavy in his hands as he pointed it at her. In his mind, she wasn't a harmless elderly woman. She was a suspect, a threat. His pulse quickened, his vision blurred by fear. Everything inside him screamed that he needed to act, and fast. Evelyn's hands went up instinctively, the way she had been taught long ago. "I don't understand," she tried to say, her voice cracking with fear. But the words barely left her lips before a deafening crack filled the air. The gunshot echoed through the park, bouncing off the trees, sending birds scattering into the sky. For a brief moment, everything was still. Then Evelyn stumbled backward, her eyes wide with disbelief as she clutched her chest. She looked down, seeing the blood beginning to stain her coat, feeling the life drain out of her body. She crumpled to the ground, falling beside her cane, the very thing that had always helped her keep steady. Officer Hayes stood frozen in place, his gun still raised, his heart pounding in his chest. Time seemed to stretch, his mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. The woman on the ground before him was not a killer, not a threat. She was an innocent elderly woman, and he had just shot her. Word of the shooting spread quickly through Greendale, a town that had never experienced anything like this. The kind of violence that had shocked cities and made headlines across the country had finally come to their doorstep. But it wasn't a story of crime or a dangerous fugitive. It was a story of a beloved community member being gunned down in cold blood by a police officer. The shockwave rippled through the town, turning grief into anger. Evelyn Johnson wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was the woman who had taught generations of children, who had volunteered at church bake sales, who had walked through the park every morning for as long as anyone could remember. She had a kind word for everyone, a warm smile, and a calming presence that made people feel safe. And now she was gone, reduced to a lifeless body under a white sheet in the middle of the park. Lisa Johnson, Evelyn's daughter, had been going about her usual morning routine when the phone call came. She had barely registered the words, incident, park, shooting, before the reality hit her like a freight train. Her mother was dead. She didn't even remember how she made it to the park, her car racing through the quiet streets, her mind numb with disbelief. When she arrived, the scene was chaos. Police tape had already been strung up around the park, and officers stood guard, their faces unreadable. A small crowd had gathered, watching in hushed silence. Reporters had already started arriving, their cameras pointed at the unfolding tragedy. But Lisa didn't care about any of that. All she could see was the sheet covering her mother's body, lying so still on the ground where she had walked every day. "Let me through," she shouted, her voice cracking with emotion. "That's my mother. Let me through." An officer tried to stop her, but she pushed past, her legs giving way as she collapsed next to the crime scene tape. The grief hit her all at once, a tidal wave of pain that left her gasping for breath. She reached out toward her mother, her hands trembling, but she couldn't get close enough. The police wouldn't let her. The world felt like it was spinning out of control, and all she could do was cry. The image of Lisa Johnson, weeping next to her mother's body, was captured by a reporter's camera and quickly spread across social media. It was a powerful, heartbreaking moment, a visual symbol of the raw pain and injustice that had struck the heart of Greendale. Within hours, the hashtags began to trend. Justice for Evelyn. Say her name. The story wasn't just about Greendale anymore. It had become a national headline. The protests started the very next day. The park, once a peaceful place where people walked their dogs and children played, had now become a site of outrage. Crowds gathered, holding signs that read, "Stop killing us," and "Black Lives Matter." The community, both black and white, marched through the streets, their voices rising in a unified cry for justice. But there was something deeper at play, a simmering tension that had always existed beneath the surface of Greendale. The town had its own share of racial divides, unspoken but always present. For years, the black community had felt the subtle sting of bias, the extra glance from a store clerk, the way police cars seemed to patrol their neighborhoods more frequently. Evelyn's death had ripped the scab off those wounds, exposing them for all to see. The town was angry, and they wanted answers. They wanted to know how a peaceful, elderly woman could be mistaken for a dangerous criminal. They wanted to know why Officer Hayes had been so quick to pull the trigger. They wanted justice, and they weren't going to stop until they got it. The trial of Officer Daniel Hayes quickly became a media circus, with every major news network in the country descending upon Greendale. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, ready to capture every moment of the proceedings. The stakes were high, not just for Hayes, but for the entire town, and in many ways, for the entire country. This wasn't just a trial about a single shooting. It was a trial about race, policing, and the deeply entrenched biases that had led to the death of an innocent black woman. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The Johnson family sat in the front row, their grief palpable, while Officer Hayes sat at the defense table, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days, and in many ways, that was true. Since the shooting, he had been haunted by what he had done, by the face of the woman he had killed. But no amount of remorse could change the fact that he was now on trial for his career, his freedom, and his future. The prosecution, led by State's Attorney Rachel Quinn, was relentless. Quinn was known for her tenacity, and she had made it clear from the start that she was going to hold Hayes accountable for Evelyn's death. "This is not just about a mistake," she said in her opening statement. "This is about a pattern of reckless behavior, driven by fear and racial bias." She argued that Hayes had not followed proper protocol, that he had acted impulsively, and that his actions were influenced by his unconscious biases. The key piece of evidence was the body cam footage. The video was shaky, but it showed the moments leading up to the shooting in stark detail. The jurors watched as Hayes exited his car, shouting commands at Evelyn, who clearly posed no threat. They saw the fear in her eyes, the way her hands went up, and then the moment when Hayes pulled the trigger. It was hard to watch, and even harder to justify. Quinn called several witnesses to the stand, including Dr. Samuel Fields, a psychologist who specialized in implicit bias. Fields explained to the jury how biases could affect decision-making, especially in high-stress situations. "Officer Hayes may not have consciously thought, 'This black woman is dangerous,'" Fields said. But years of societal conditioning, combined with the stress of the moment, led him to see a threat where there was none. The defense, led by John Monroe, took a different approach. Monroe had built his career defending police officers, and he knew how to appeal to the jury's sense of fear and uncertainty. He argued that Hayes had been doing his job, responding to a call about a dangerous suspect. Officer Hayes didn't have the luxury of hindsight, Monroe said. He had to make a decision in a split second, under extreme stress. And in that moment, he believed his life was in danger. Monroe called Officer Richard Barnes, a use-of-force expert, to testify that Hayes's actions were consistent with police training. Barnes explained how officers were trained to respond quickly to perceived threats without hesitation. Hesitation can mean the difference between life and death, Barnes said. The jury deliberated for 5 long days. The tension in the town was palpable, with protesters gathering outside the courthouse every day, their chants growing louder as the days passed. The whole country seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the verdict that would either bring justice or tear the community apart. When the jury finally returned with a verdict, the courtroom was filled with a heavy silence. Lisa Johnson sat at the front, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her heart pounding in her chest. She had prepared herself for this moment, but nothing could truly prepare her for the weight of what was about to happen. The foreman stood, his face unreadable as he began to speak. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Daniel Hayes, not guilty of manslaughter." The words seemed to hang in the air, as though the entire room had been frozen in time. For a brief moment, no one moved. Then the reaction exploded. Some people screamed in outrage, their voices rising in protest. Others sobbed in relief, grateful that Hayes had been spared. But Lisa sat frozen in her seat, tears streaming down her face. Her mother was dead, and the man responsible had just walked free. Outside the courthouse, the news spread like wildfire. Protesters erupted in anger, their chants of "no justice, no peace" echoing through the streets. Signs bearing Evelyn's face were raised high, and the crowd surged forward, demanding accountability. On the other side of the street, counter-protesters gathered, holding signs that read, "Back the Blue" and "Support our police." The tension between the two groups had been simmering for weeks, and now it was boiling over. Greendale was no longer the peaceful, idyllic town it had once been. It was now a battleground, a microcosm of the larger national debate over race and policing. Neighbors who had once shared backyard barbecues now found themselves on opposite sides of the divide. Lawns were dotted with signs, some in support of the Johnson family, others in support of Officer Hayes. For Lisa, the verdict was a devastating blow. She had hoped that the trial would bring some measure of justice for her mother, but instead, it had only deepened her pain. She had always known that the system was flawed, that it often protected officers who took black lives. But hearing the words, "not guilty," still felt like a slap in the face. But Lisa was not the only one struggling with the verdict. Officer Hayes, too, was grappling with the weight of what he had done. Although he had been cleared of criminal charges, he couldn't escape the guilt that gnawed at him. His career was effectively over. There was no way he could return to the force after this, but that wasn't what kept him up at night. What haunted him was the face of Evelyn Johnson, the sound of the gunshot, the realization that he had taken an innocent life. As the days passed, the protests continued. Reverend Marcus Owens, who had been at the forefront of the movement for justice, continued to lead marches through the town. "This fight isn't over," he told the crowd at one rally. "We didn't get justice in that courtroom, but we're going to keep fighting until we do." The Johnson family became a symbol of the larger fight for police reform. Lisa, though still grieving, found herself drawn into the movement. She had never seen herself as an activist, but now she had no choice. Her mother's death had ignited something inside her, a fire that couldn't be extinguished. She began speaking at rallies, organizing community meetings, and demanding changes to the laws that allowed officers like Hayes to use deadly force with impunity. Slowly, Greendale began to change. The town was still deeply divided, but the movement for police reform was gaining momentum. The mayor announced the formation of a civilian oversight board to investigate future cases of police misconduct, and the police department began implementing new training programs on implicit bias and use of force protocols. But for Lisa, the fight wasn't just about changing laws. It was about making sure her mother's death wasn't in vain. Evelyn Johnson had been a teacher, a mother, a community member, and she deserved to be remembered for the life she had lived, not just the way she had died. Months later, the park where Evelyn had been killed was renamed in her honor, Evelyn Johnson Memorial Park. A plaque was placed at the entrance, bearing her name and a quote that she had often shared with her students. "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." The community gathered for the dedication ceremony, a moment of both reflection and hope. Lisa stood by the plaque, her hand resting on the cold metal, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. The fight for justice was far from over, but as Lisa looked out at the crowd gathered in the park, black and white, young and old, she knew that her mother's death had sparked something larger than herself. It had sparked a movement, one that would continue to grow, to demand change, to fight for a world where no more mothers had to bury their children, and no more children had to lose their mothers to violence. As the sun set over the park, casting long shadows across the ground, Lisa whispered her final vow to her mother. "I will keep fighting, Mom, for you and for everyone else. I won't let them forget." The tragic death of Evelyn Johnson became more than just a senseless act of violence. It became the catalyst for a movement that would bring about real change. But the road to justice is long, and the fight is far from over. Officer Daniel Hayes may have walked free, but the battle for accountability, reform, and equality continues. Stay tuned as we follow the developments and the impact of Evelyn's legacy.